A more recent pandemic is HIV. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus, and it is the pathogen that leads to the disease known as AIDS. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome because it's a deficiency in the immune system that is acquired by the infection of the virus known as HIV. HIV was first recognized by the medical community on December 1st, 1981. Subsequent to that, AIDS has killed more than 25 million people in 30 years. 1/3 of the individuals in some regions of sub-Saharan Africa are infected with HIV. Worldwide, the percentage is 0.6%. HIV is a retrovirus. Retroviruses are viruses that start as RNA and then copy themselves into DNA. If you remember from the very first lecture in this class, typically DNA is copied into RNA and then that's copied into proteins. But this goes in reverse from RNA to DNA, and that's why it's referred to as a retrovirus. So HIV, when it is outside the body or outside of a cell, is an RNA molecule encased in a protein coat. And then when it enters a cell, it copies itself into a DNA molecule that then incorporates and becomes a permanent part of the cell's DNA. The enzyme responsible for converting the RNA into DNA is known as reverse transcriptase because it reverses the process of transcription. Remember, transcription from our first lecture is taking DNA and turning it into RNA. Once the DNA becomes incorporated into the host cell's chromosomes, it then is there permanently and can remain dormant in that host cell for decades, or it can replicate and cause disease. Infection of HIV occurs by the transfer of bodily fluids such as blood, semen, vaginal fluid, or breast milk. Within these fluids, HIV is present as a free-floating virus, as well as held within white blood cells. The virus infects only a subclassification of cells of the body. The only cells that HIV infects are a subset of white blood cells, known as helper T cells, macrophages, and dendritic cells. The virus kills these infected cells slowly over time, and this affects the entire body's ability to fight disease. Once the body has a weakened immune system, it then succumbs to alternative pathogens. Infection of HIV has 4 stages. The first stage is incubation period. This lasts from 2 to 4 weeks. During this time period, the HIV viral particle number increases, while the white blood cell count, specifically the helper T cells, which are mapped here in blue, decreases. This leads to a point known as the acute infection stage, when the virus is higher in number and some symptoms begin to show. The first symptoms of HIV infection occur about a month into the infection and last for about a month. They include having a fever, swollen lymph nodes, a sore throat, and a painless, itchless rash on the skin. It's like a flu, but with a skin rash. After that, the white blood cell count starts to come back, and the HIV viral particle numbers decrease. This leads to what's known as the latent stage. Latency is when very few to no symptoms are noticed, and this can last for a few weeks to a few decades. White blood cell counts fluctuate during this time, and generally HIV viral particle count is low, but the individual infected with HIV can still cause infections in other individuals. This eventually leads to clinical manifestation of symptoms as the HIV viral particles skyrocket and the white blood cell count diminishes to low or even sometimes undetectable levels. This is when AIDS forms. AIDS leads to death, generally by infection of another pathogen. AIDS is characterized by having unusual infections that typically do not infect individuals with healthy immune systems, as well as rapid weight loss, skin rashes, and oral sores in the mouth. 90% of people with HIV eventually form AIDS within 10 years. However, once infected with AIDS and developing AIDS, the individual usually has just 1 year to live. That was without treatment. There is medicine that's available that can extend life for 5 years or more. That medicine is what's referred to as highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART. This is also what's referred to as the drug cocktails that some people with HIV are on. If an individual has HIV and goes on HAART treatment before AIDS develops, then they have a life expectancy of 30 years or more. Compared to the typical 10 years, this can, in some cases, lead to an almost typical life expectancy with little to no symptoms. The patients just have to make sure that they stay on the drug cocktail or HAART drugs for the rest of their life. Now, while HIV continues to remain an infection of concern, and a lot of research continues trying to discover cures or vaccines against HIV, the current HAART treatment is very helpful. We're now going to move on to an even more recent pandemic, which brings us back to the flu. In 2009, a flu strain known as H1N1, also at the time colloquially referred to as the swine flu, developed. The reason why it was identified as a pandemic early on was because it was different from the seasonal flu in that it first appeared in April. Seasonal flu usually begins around October, November in the United States. But cases of this particular flu were being noticed in late spring. It also appeared that the vaccinations against flu at the time had no effect on this H1N1 strain. As a result of rapid transmission, investigations were done trying to figure out where this virus came from. The virus was traced back to a child in Mexico, where this strain of H1N1 was in fact a genetic combination of previous flu strains that existed prior to 2009. It included 2 different strains of swine flu, a human flu strain, and a bird flu strain. That means that this 2009 H1N1 flu strain had genes from all of these different sources. These all came together probably by the human and the bird flu coming together in either a chicken or duck, and then that combining with two different swine flus, again in farm animals. And then a young child in Mexico spending time with a farm animal that her family owned ended up acquiring this new strain. This new strain was then transmitted to family members and friends and eventually led to infections in people in many parts of the world. This flu strain didn't just come from 3 different species, it also came from 3 different areas around the world. It was a result of different flu strains from North America, Asia, and Europe. So pigs and ducks and chickens moving around the world in shipping containers increased the combination of the DNA that led to the formation of this particular pandemic. Again, suggesting that global travel of not only humans, but also our farm animals and food has led to the development of these new diseases. Now, what made H1N1 different from the seasonal flu, where as I mentioned, it started in April, but that wasn't the only thing that was different. It was also far more contagious than the seasonal flu strains. Once infected, individuals that had H1N1 were far more contagious for a lot longer, so they were able to infect more people for a longer period of time. Thankfully, H1N1 did not have a different mortality rate compared to the seasonal flu. H1N1 killed 4,000 people in about 6 months, whereas the seasonal flu kills 40,000 people per year in the United States. So far more than the H1N1 strain. While seasonal flu vaccine did not provide resistance to H1N1 in 2009, subsequent seasonal flu vaccines have been developed to fight this particular disease. An interesting side note is that it was noted that in 2009, individuals that were susceptible to H1N1 included people of many different age groups, except the very old. People who were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s seemed to be able to resist the H1N1 flu more than would typically be expected. It was discovered that the reason for this was because if these older Americans had, prior to 1960, received either the flu vaccine or actually got sick from the flu, they were immune to H1N1. Scientists discovered that the reason for this was because the flu strains that were going around prior to 1960 had the genes found in these different forms of flu strain that eventually ended up in the 2009 strain of H1N1. What this means is that if you get vaccinated this year against the flu, you're not just protecting yourself against this year's flu strains, but also flu strains for the foreseeable future, many decades into your life, that may use these same genes again. Because new flu strains that come around every year are just recombined versions of old flu strains that are still floating around the world today. That's it for our pandemic lecture. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot.